Hi divers, Alec Peirce again from Scuba 2000 Tech Tips. Here we go with some more ideas that might make your diving a little more fun, a little bit easier, or at least if nothing else, give you something to think about, teach you something. I hope some of these tech tips are useful to you. If they're not useful, don't watch. But if you get some ideas out of there, then I'm a happy man. Okay, today we want to talk about tanks. Scuba tanks, that is. And, you know, people think the tanks are the most important part of a scuba system, and I guess they're pretty vital because of the air in them. There are other parts that's debatable, but certainly the scuba tank is an awfully important part of scuba diving. It is what, in fact, gives you the air supply that we can scuba dive. So I guess they're pretty important. Okay, we'll agree on that. However, scuba tanks are also sometimes a source of problems. They can be a source of problems if they're not properly taken care of. Many divers today don't even own their own tanks. If you're a diver that travels south, mainly, does not dive locally, here in this case with me in Ontario, if you don't dive locally, then perhaps you don't need to own a tank. If you travel south, of course, you don't take tanks when you travel, when you fly anyway. If you're diving locally, you can rent tanks. It's very inexpensive to rent a tank. You rent a tank for $15 a day. If you own a tank, it costs you $10 to fill it. So you're really only renting the tank for $5 a day, and you avoid all this concern about the tanks themselves. However, that aside, let's take a look today at tanks. There's sometimes a little bit of confusion, a little bit of mystery about scuba tanks. There's nothing mysterious. So it's an aluminum bottle, steel or aluminum bottle container, if you like, with threads in the top. You put a valve in it, and you can put your regulator on the valve. And we put air into these bottles, into these tanks, compressed air, and then you use it up when you're diving. It's really a very simple concept. But let's take a look at the tank itself. This is a pretty standard, in fact, this is the standard tank today, what's commonly called the 80 cubic foot aluminum tank. It's been the standard now since about the mid-80s, and it pretty much is what you will find everywhere in the world. When you rent or buy, and this is most likely what you'll see. 80 cubic foot aluminum tank. A couple of manufacturers, only one or two in North America, only 3 or 4 around the world, because this is obviously quite a process to make an aluminum tank like this that not only is safe to use, but meets all the government standards and everything else. So there are not too many companies that make them. It's a big investment. This particular tank was made by Catalina, one of the largest manufacturers of scuba tanks in the world. And let's take a look at it and just see what's involved in maintaining the tank. You buy a brand spanking new tank, off you go, lots of air, scuba diving. What do you have to do to keep the tank in good condition? Well, let's take a look at that. There are 2 tests that have to be performed on a tank on a regular basis. The one test is called the visual inspection. Now, the visual inspection is unique to scuba. Other high-pressure cylinders, oxygen cylinders for medical purposes, or acetylene cylinders, or propane tanks, they do not need to have a visual examination. That's unique to scuba. And it's unique to scuba because scuba is a marine sport, meaning it takes place near water, and often salt water, which is very, very hard on anything, and is hard on metal as well. And the other reason, sorry about this, but scuba divers are not noted, generally, many of you may be, but they're not noted for being really fastidious, really careful with your equipment. So because these tanks are used in a marine environment and they're used by sports people who may or may not take care of them, there has developed over many, many years this industry protocol of having a visual inspection every year. A visual inspection is something that every 12 months you need to do. The visual inspection is really a very simple process. You take it to a professional. It does have to be a licensed professional or certified professional visual inspector. And quite frankly, what he does is a complete visual inspection of your tank inside and out, to be sure that it has not suffered any abuse, that there's no corrosion, that the threads and everything about that tank are safe to use. And if they are, you get a sticker and on you go. If there are not, you may be able to correct any problems, otherwise the tank could be scrapped. So what's involved in the visual examination? Well, it's really very simple. First of all, the inspector will take the air to the tank, open the valve, let all the air to the tank. And then next he will take the valve out of the tank. The valves look just like this. And this is a pretty standard valve, as is used on any high pressure type of device, any high pressure cylinder, with a couple of exceptions. The scuba valve has what's called a dip tube. There's a little extension on there. And the dip tube is on there for a very simple reason. Scuba cylinders, by their very nature, are used. They're mobile. They're carried around on their backs. And it's possible for a scuba cylinder to be in this position, which means that there is any rust or corrosion or a moisture or anything inside the tank that is not supposed to be there, is not good, that would all run down and run right through the hole and come out through the opening and into your regulator. Not good. So Scuba cylinder valves have a dip tube, so any material runs down and cannot get into the hole. The hole is at the end of the dip tube. Very simple idea, and a good idea as well. But this is generally what a valve looks like on a modern Scuba cylinder. This particular valve we call a converter valve because it's rather interesting. You see it has a standard O-ring with the opening for the air. But if you are using a DIN regulator, and we can talk about that some other time, a DIN regulator, which does not use a standard Scuba yoke, you can take the center out of this valve and it turns into a DIN, or threaded if you like, valve. Now a DIN regulator, which has threads on it, will now thread in and seal. It doesn't have a yoke to clamp around the back. So this particular valve, converter valve, what we use here at Scuba 2000, all of our tanks, is handy that way. Not a lot of people use DIN valves in North America, but some do, and this valve allows both divers, both styles of regulators to be used with this tank. Okay, small thing about valves. Now, the valve comes out. The inspector during the inspection actually inspects the valve as well. Makes sure that it's working properly, not leaking. There are two O-rings on the valve. The big O-ring that seals in the neck looks like this, and the small O-ring that seals in the face. This is the one that seals the regulator. Looks like this. Those two O-rings are always replaced, even if they're in good shape. We don't even look at them. We take them out, and they're trashed. Actually, they're kept until the customer sees them, and then they're thrown in the trash and replaced. These cost a couple of bucks. It just isn't worth it. Every 12 months, we just replace them. Okay? So that's the first step in doing the visual examination. Of course, the inspector has already looked at the tank to see that there's no abuse, no dents, no scratches. The boot is actually taken off to look underneath the boot, make sure there's nothing hidden, the bottom, everything. And then he inspects the threads up here. It's possible that the threads into which the valve is screwed can get damaged too. So they're inspected very carefully. Older tanks in particular, the threads are inspected very, very carefully to be sure that over a period of time, under sustained pressure, they have not corroded or caused problems. There's a special device for that, an optical device. This little device goes down into the cylinder, I turn the light on, and it has highly magnified. I can see right into each one of those threads, all the way around, all the way up. I can check each and every thread for any signs of distress, any signs of corrosion or damage, to be sure that the threads in the cylinder are in really good shape. I've already checked the threads in the valve, so that issue is gone. So now the inspector will, having done all of that, he will now take a look inside. How does he do that? Well, first of all, you need a light. So there's a special light. It's called a visual inspection light. Now, they sat up all night thinking of that name. Anyway, and this goes down inside the tank. You can see it's very, very bright and allows you to go around the tank and throw shadows. And what we're looking for, well, what we're looking for, to be perfectly frank, is anything. Anything. Because there should be nothing in there. It should be nice, smooth, clean aluminum. Not glossy like this, but otherwise smooth and clean. So we might find particles, we might find bits of chrome, we might find little black particles if the compressor where you've been getting your air is not perfect. We might find white powder, which would be an indication that there's been some salt water in there. Anything we find in there, we have to inspect it carefully, clean it out, make sure that it's perfect on the inside. And that's a fairly simple process, but it does require training to be sure that what you're looking for is what you think it is, and then how to clean it and treat it as well, so the tank can then be given back to the customer perfectly clean and ready to use. Once all that's done and the inspector is satisfied that the tank is in good shape, he puts the valve back into the proper torque, and then he fills the tank to its proper pressure, and he puts a visual sticker. It's just a sticker that goes on. So every year you should have a sticker like this. In this case it says Scuba 2000. It may not always do that. It could say PADI, it could say PSI, or the store name, as in this case. But the sticker will show you that it's had a visual inspection, and it'll show the date. So this one was done in February of 2016, you see, and it had a marked out visual inspection because there are other procedures that can also be done on a Scuba tank. So this tank had a visual inspection in February of 2016. It's ready to go. Good tank. Every year we do that. Now the other test that has to be done on Scuba tanks, and by the way, I should mention that the visual examination is relatively inexpensive. You're looking at probably $20, a couple of O-rings and an air fill, probably $25, $30. You're in and out once a year. And then you know your tank is safe to use. The other test that has to be done every 5 years, every 5th year, is called the hydrostatic test. It's a little more involved. In fact, in most cases, the tank goes out. Many years ago, lots of dive stores did hydrostatic tests right in-house. Not so many anymore. The regulations, the training, the equipment, it's messy and wet. Just the whole procedure is not very nice to have in a dive shop. And to be perfectly honest, there's not much money in it either. So most cylinders now go out to a professional hydro testing station. That's all they do. They test tanks. So they can make it profitable. So this tank goes out and the valve is taken out, air is taken out, of course, then the valve's taken out, the bush's taken out, and the cylinder alone, the bare cylinder, goes to a hydrostatic test station. And the hydrostatic test station, the hydrostatic test itself is very simple. They are testing the metal to make sure that it still is good, and specifically to make sure it still is elastic. You may or may not know this, but when you fill your Scuba cylinder, it gets bigger. And then when you breathe all the air, it actually gets smaller. You could measure it if you wanted to. If you put a steel tape around this and measure, you can actually measure that change. It gets bigger and then smaller, bigger and then smaller. Every time it gets bigger, kind of like a balloon or elastic band, and then gets smaller, it shrinks back down, but not quite to its original size. Almost, but not quite. It's a little bit bigger than it was before. I suppose if you filled it and emptied it and filled it enough, you'd have a 81 cubic foot tank. No, it doesn't stretch that much. A little wee bit. Anyway, by measuring the stretch and then how close it goes back to its original size, the hydrostatic test inspector can tell whether or not this metal is still elastic, still good. If the metal you see becomes hard and crystallized, well, what will happen then is you expand it and it'll stay there. Or even worse, it'll crack. Not very good. So that's what they test, is the elasticity of the metal. That's all they do. And once they've done that and determined, yeah, this cylinder's good, then they stamp it with an actual stamp right in the metal. So a little bit different. So if you take a look at this cylinder, you can see that this cylinder was made in the 6th month of 2012. So in 2017. This will have to have a hydrostatic test, okay? And over here we can see the pressure. I usually underline these vital pieces of information on a customer's tank so they're easy to spot. This tank is quite new. Take a look at this tank I have down here on the floor, and you'll see what can happen. This tank was made back in 1993, and then it was tested. You can see there's a new stamp on here, 1999. And then it was stamped again very recently. We just did this for the customer. This was stamped in 2015, you see? So this is a stamp. It's right in the metal. That can't be peeled off. It's not a sticker like the visual sticker. So after you have the hydrostatic test that's been stamped, and you have a tank good for another 5 years, you're all set to go. So your tank is hydrostatically tested and safe to use. Your tank has been visually inspected and safe to use. Let's go diving. Fill it up with air and away we go. So those are the two tests that have to be done annually and then every 5 years. The hydrostatic test I want to mention, as I did with the visual, the approximate cost, you're looking at about $50 by the time you get out of the store, because the hydrostatic test itself is $20 or $25, and then we still do the visual. So that's another $20 and a couple of O-rings and air fill and so on. Probably $40, $50 at least for your hydrostatic test every 5 years. It's actually pretty cheap. Make sure your tank's in good shape. There you go. I hope that answers a few questions and maybe it clears up some of the confusion. Very simple. Visual examination every year, hydrostatic test every 5 years. Go to your local dive store, they'll explain all this to you and help you with your tank. Hope this has been interesting, and I will see you again very soon. Alec, Peirce, Scuba 2000 Tech Tips. See you soon.